When the heavy iron gates of the federal penitentiary finally opened after 12 long years, I did not call my wife. I did not call my brother. I simply took a cab straight to the Connecticut estate I had built from absolutely nothing. I was supposed to serve 20 years for a corporate fraud I never committed, but a newly unsealed digital footprint had just cleared my name. I thought I was coming home to a family that had suffered alongside me, a family that had waited for my return. But as I stood in the hallway of my own home listening to the clink of ice in whiskey glasses, I heard the two people I loved most in this world laughing. They were laughing about how they had stolen my $50 million company, drained my retirement, and planned to lock me in a nursing home if I ever managed to get out. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just listened. And then I made a decision that would change everything. If you are listening to my story today, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is the kind of betrayal you only think happens in movies until it happens in your own living room. If you have ever been stabbed in the back by the people you trusted most, hit the like button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It helps a 70-year-old man know he is not alone in this world. My name is Richard Caldwell. 12 years ago, my life was taken from me. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Caldwell Tech, a company I nurtured from a small garage project into an empire. I had it all. A brilliant brother named Edward, who served as my chief financial officer, and a beautiful, supportive wife named Diana. We were a team, or so I believed. When the federal investigators raided our offices 12 years ago, they found fabricated ledgers and illegal offshore transfers bearing my digital signature. I was blindsided. I went to prison protesting my innocence, believing that my brother and my wife would fight on the outside to clear my name. I spent over 4,000 days in a concrete cell, surviving on the thought of returning to them. Today was that day. The exoneration came suddenly. A routine audit of an old server revealed the truth about the signatures, granting me an immediate and quiet release. They gave me a gray paper bag containing the clothes I was arrested in, and I walked out into the free world. I did not want a parade or a dramatic phone call. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to surprise the woman who had written me letters for the first few years before her visits slowly faded away. I wanted to embrace the brother who claimed he was working day and night to hold my company together. The cab dropped me off at the end of the long driveway of my Tudor-style mansion in Connecticut. The autumn air was crisp. The manicured lawns looked exactly as I remembered. I paid the driver with the little cash I had left in my wallet and walked up to the heavy oak front door. I knew my keys had been confiscated long ago, but I also knew about the spare key I had hidden inside a fake stone under the large planter on the porch. I reached down my 70-year-old joints, aching from a decade of prison beds, and felt the cold metal. It was still there. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it quietly. The door pushed open without a sound. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and polished wood. It was warm, inviting, and completely silent. I took a slow step inside, holding my gray paper bag. I wanted to call out their names, but a strange, heavy feeling settled in my chest. Call it the instinct of a man who had to survive among predators for 12 years. Something did not feel right. As I walked softly down the long hallway toward the back of the house, I heard a sound coming from my old study. The door was slightly ajar, spilling a slice of warm yellow light onto the hardwood floor. I heard the unmistakable clink of ice dropping into crystal glasses. Then I heard his voice. It was Edward. His tone was not stressed or burdened as he always claimed to be in his rare messages to me. It was relaxed, confident, and dripping with arrogance. "The lawyer just called," Edward said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. "Richard got his early parole approved today. He is officially a free man." I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart leaped in my chest. They knew. They already knew I was coming home. I raised my hand, ready to push the door open, and announce myself ready to share the joy of this moment. But before my fingers could touch the wood, a second voice spoke. It was Diana. The voice of my wife, the woman I had thought about every single night as I stared at a concrete ceiling. "Well, that is incredibly inconvenient," Diana said. Her voice was ice cold. There was no joy. There was no relief. There was only pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Did you wire the last $10 million from his retirement fund to the offshore account like we planned?" My hand froze in midair. The air in my lungs suddenly felt thick, like I was inhaling glass. I stood perfectly still, my ear pressed near the gap in the door. "Done," Edward replied, letting out a soft, satisfied chuckle. "I finished the transfer an hour ago. Every single trace of his liquid assets has been scrubbed, funneled through 3 different shell companies, and deposited into our Swiss account. That 70-year-old convict has absolutely nothing left to his name. The company is completely in my control, and his personal accounts are empty." I could not breathe. The world spun around me. My brother, my own flesh and blood. The man I had trusted with my entire life's work was casually discussing how he had drained my life savings. Diana let out a dark, mocking laugh that sent chills down my spine. It was a sound I had never heard from her before. "Good," she said, taking a sip of her drink. "Let him come home. What is he going to do? He is a disgraced, broke old man. If he shows up here demanding his life back, we will just toss him in some cheap, run-down nursing home. We can claim his mind deteriorated in prison. No one will question us. We have the power of attorney after all." "Exactly," Edward agreed, clinking his glass against hers. "To us, Diana. To the perfect crime and the perfect life." They were toasting. They were standing in my study, drinking my whiskey, celebrating the destruction of my life. In a matter of seconds, 12 years of longing and love turned into a thick, suffocating ash. They had known all along. They had orchestrated it all along. The pain was so sharp, so physical, it felt like a knife twisting between my ribs. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to scream until my throat bled, but I did not. The prison had taught me one very important lesson. When you are surrounded by wolves, you do not cry. You do not show weakness. You observe and you prepare your counterattack. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from a rage so profound it transcended anger. As my hand shook, the cheap gray paper bag I was holding slipped from my grip. It hit a small decorative glass vase sitting on the hallway console table. The vase tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet elegance of the house like a gunshot. Inside the study, the laughter abruptly stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. A terrifying, heavy silence fell over the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Edward's voice was tense, sudden panic replacing his arrogance. "It was probably just the wind," Diana whispered, though her voice shook. I did not run. I did not hide. I slowly raised my foot and kicked the remaining shards of glass out of the way. Then I stepped directly into the open doorway of the study. Edward and Diana were standing by the fireplace, their drinks frozen halfway to their mouths. When they turned and saw me standing there, the color instantly drained from their faces. They looked as if they had just seen a ghost. And in a way they had. The naive, trusting Richard Caldwell, who went to prison 12 years ago, was dead. The man standing before them was someone completely different. I looked at my brother, who was wearing my father's watch. I looked at my wife, who was wearing a diamond necklace I had bought her for our anniversary. I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I simply stood there, my posture straight, my eyes locked onto theirs, with the cold, dead stare of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Hello, Edward." "Hello, Diana," I said, my voice low and perfectly steady. "I hope I am not interrupting a celebration." They stared at me in absolute paralyzed horror. The game had just changed, and they had no idea what was coming next. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. I stood in the doorway, staring at the two people I had spent 4,000 nights thinking about. Edward and Diana were frozen. The color drained from their faces. I saw sheer terror in their eyes. They thought I was a ghost. But predators are nothing if not adaptable. The shock lasted 3 seconds before their survival instinct kicked in. Diana moved first. The cold woman plotting to lock me in a nursing home vanished. Her face crumpled into a mask of overwhelming emotion. She dropped her glass onto the Persian rug, spilling whiskey, and let out a dramatic gasp. Tears sprang to her eyes instantly. She rushed across the room, heels clicking frantically, and threw her arms around my neck. She buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing. "Richard," she cried, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, you are finally home." She squeezed me tight, but I felt nothing. Her perfume now smelled like poison. A moment later, Edward snapped out of his paralysis. He slammed his glass down and hurried over. He grabbed my right hand, squeezing it with the desperate grip of a loving brother. His eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears. Brother Edward choked out. "They did not tell us. The lawyer just said the parole was approved. We did not know you were coming today. Look at you. We missed you so much." I stood in their suffocating embrace. 12 years ago, I would have wept with joy. I would have thanked God for returning me to my family. But now, feeling my wife's fake tears soaking my prison shirt and my brother's treacherous hands gripping mine, all I felt was cold rage. I let them play their parts. Then I slowly peeled Diana's arms off my neck. I pulled my hand away from Edward's grip and took a step back. The smile I forced was gone. "I missed you too," I said, dangerously calm. "But before we celebrate, I have a question. What $10 million and what offshore account in Switzerland?" The room went dead silent. Diana's sobs hitched. Edward's jaw tightened. They knew I had heard them. I watched their eyes dart back and forth, silently communicating. I wanted to see them fall to their knees and confess. But Edward was far too smart for that. He was the chief financial officer for a reason. He was a master of spinning disasters. He took a deep breath and flawlessly he pivoted. Edward did not look guilty. Instead, he looked profoundly exhausted. He let out a long sigh and ran a hand through his graying hair, playing the burdened martyr perfectly. "I was hoping we could give you one night of peace before explaining the nightmare we have been living," Edward said with terrifying sincerity. "Richard, when you were convicted, the federal government did not just want you in prison. The Securities and Exchange Commission came after Caldwell Tech with everything they had. They wanted to liquidate your entire life's work to pay off federal fines. They wanted to seize every asset and every dollar you earned." Diana stepped forward, wiping her dry eyes, her voice quivering with righteous indignation. "We were losing everything, Richard. The board of directors turned their backs on us. The media called you a monster. We had to make a choice. We had to protect your legacy even if it meant looking like the villains." Edward stepped closer, his tone urgent and pleading. "I hired the best defense attorneys, but they said the only way to shield the company's capital from federal seizure was to move it out of your name entirely. We had to act fast. Diana and I faked a separation of assets. We set up a spousal preservation trust in an offshore jurisdiction where federal agents could not touch it. That is the Swiss account you heard about." He placed a hand firmly on my shoulder, looking at me with the ultimate expression of brotherly devotion. "We funneled every liquid asset, including that last $10 million from your retirement fund, into that trust today because the final audit was closing. If we had left it in your name, the government would have seized it the moment you walked out of those prison gates. We played the bad guys. We let everyone think we abandoned you just to save your legacy." Diana moved to my other side, gently resting her hand on my chest. "When you heard me talking about putting you in a nursing home, I was just making a bitter joke about how the media expects us to treat you. We have spent 12 years fighting in the shadows to keep your empire alive. We did it all for you, my love. It was a masterpiece. It was the most brilliant, plausible lie I had ever heard. If I had not had 12 years of silence in a cell to sharpen my mind, if I had not learned how to spot a con artist, I would have believed them completely. The logic was sound. The legal jargon was accurate. The emotional delivery was flawless. They had rehearsed this contingency plan perfectly, but they had made one critical mistake. They forgot that I knew how much money was actually in my retirement fund before I went to prison. And I knew that a spousal preservation trust did not require funneling money through anonymous shell companies. They were lying straight to my face. I looked at Edward. I looked at Diana. I realized how incredibly dangerous they were. If I confronted them now, they would destroy the evidence and probably find a way to eliminate me for good. I had no money, no power, and no allies. I needed time. I needed to play their game better than they did, so I let my shoulders slump. I let out a trembling breath, forcing my eyes to water. I allowed a single tear to roll down my weathered cheek. I reached out and pulled both of them into a tight, emotional embrace. "I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking with manufactured guilt. "I am so sorry I doubted you. I have been in the dark for so long. Thank you. Thank you both for sacrificing so much to save my life's work. I do not know what I would do without you." Diana hugged me back tightly, burying her face in my chest. Edward patted my back with strong thumps. "You are home now, Richard," Edward said softly. "Everything is going to be okay. We will take care of you from now on." "I know you both will," I replied, squeezing them closer. But as I held them staring over Edward's shoulder at the dark wall of my study, my eyes were completely dry. The forced warmth in my voice evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. I did not believe a single word they had said. They thought they had successfully manipulated a broken, clueless old man. They thought the danger had passed. But they were wrong. The war had only just begun. The war had only just begun. I quickly learned the rules of my new reality. Under the guise of absolute care and devotion, my brother and my wife constructed a golden cage for me. They moved my belongings into a cramped, windowless guest room on the ground floor of the estate. The room was tucked away at the end of a long, isolated corridor, far from the main living areas. Edward told me with a patronizing smile that it was for my own safety. He said my old legs should not have to take the stairs after so many years sleeping on a hard prison cot. I nodded and accepted my new quarters without a single complaint. I knew it was not about my comfort. It was about keeping me completely out of the way. They wanted me out of sight and out of mind, a convenient ghost haunting the edges of their glamorous life. The restrictions did not stop with my living arrangements. They gave me an allowance of $100 a week in cash, claiming my bank accounts were still frozen by federal regulators. I was a man who had built a $50 million technology empire, and now I was being handed pocket change like a simple teenager. Furthermore, Edward strictly forbade me from visiting the Caldwell Tech headquarters under any circumstances. He cited the intense media scrutiny that would surely follow my release from prison. He warned that my presence would destabilize stock prices and panic investors. I agreed to stay hidden. I played the part of the weary, defeated old man who just wanted a quiet corner to rest his head. But behind the closed door of my windowless room, my mind was racing, cataloging every detail, every lie, and every piece of evidence. The physical signs of their betrayal were everywhere, hidden in plain sight. They were arrogant, flaunting the wealth they had stolen from me, believing I was too naive or broken to notice the truth. One morning at the breakfast table, I watched Edward casually adjust his expensive shirt cuff. Glinting in the morning sunlight was my father's vintage Patek Philippe watch. It was a rare, intricate timepiece that my father explicitly passed down to me on his deathbed. I had carefully left it in the master bedroom safe the day I was arrested. Edward caught me staring at his wrist. He smiled smoothly, claiming he had managed to buy it back from a pawn shop after federal agents seized my personal property. It was a blatant lie. The federal agents never seized our family heirlooms, but I forced a grateful smile and thanked him sincerely for rescuing it. Diana was no better. She glided through the mansion wearing stunning jewelry that I immediately recognized. One evening, she wore a brilliant diamond necklace to a charity dinner. It was the exact piece I custom designed for her on our 10th wedding anniversary. When I complimented her on it, she let out a light, dismissive laugh. She told me it was just a cheap knockoff she found at a local boutique, a fake copy to help her pretend she still had the life we once shared. She said she had sold the original to pay for my mounting legal defense fees. I knew she was lying. The way the light caught the facets of those stones was absolutely unmistakable. They were real diamonds. My diamonds. They were wearing my life like a costume, performing a sickening play where they were the tragic heroes and I was the helpless burden they graciously tolerated. But the stolen wealth was not the most dangerous part of their master plan. The true horror of my situation revealed itself in the quiet evenings. Every single night around 9 o'clock, Diana would knock softly on my bedroom door. She would enter holding a delicate porcelain cup filled with steaming chamomile tea. Her face would soften into a mask of pure angelic concern. She told me she had read medical articles about prison-induced insomnia and the severe trauma of reintegrating into society. She insisted the tea was a special organic blend mixed with natural supplements to help calm my nerves and soothe my tired mind. For the first week, I drank it. I wanted to play along to show them I was entirely dependent on their daily care like a helpless child. But something very strange started happening to my body. Every morning I would wake up feeling as though I were wading through a thick, suffocating fog. My thoughts were extremely sluggish, as if I had not slept. My vision blurred heavily around the edges. Most terrifying of all, my own hands began to shake uncontrollably. I would sit on the edge of my bed, watching my fingers tremble, entirely unable to make them stop. I was a perfectly healthy 70-year-old man who had maintained a rigorous physical exercise routine throughout my entire prison sentence. I had never experienced any neurological tremors before this moment. I remembered Diana's cold, heartless voice in the study, joking about how the media expects a convict's mind to naturally deteriorate. I remembered Edward saying they could legally claim my sanity slipped away in prison. The tremors were certainly not a natural symptom of aging. They were the direct result of a deliberate, calculated poisoning. I had to test my theory without arousing suspicion. The next night, when Diana brought the steaming cup of chamomile tea, I thanked her profusely. I took a small, cautious sip while she stood there praising the soothing taste. Satisfied I was consuming her remedy, she smiled warmly, wished me good night, and closed the door behind her. As soon as I heard her footsteps fade down the long hallway, I moved quickly. I carried the cup over to the dark corner of my room. There, sitting in a heavy ceramic pot, was a large, vibrant green fern that Diana had placed in the room to make it look more welcoming. I poured the contents into the soil of the plant. I rinsed the cup in my sink and left it empty on the nightstand for Diana to collect. I repeated this process the following night. I poured the tainted liquid directly into the roots of the fern. I waited in silence, watching the plant closely for any changes. It did not take long to see the results. Just 2 days later, the vibrant green fern was completely unrecognizable. The leaves had turned a sickly necrotic yellow. The stems had shriveled and collapsed, rotting from the roots upward. The plant was entirely dead, killed by whatever chemical cocktail Diana was brewing for me every night. I stood in my windowless room, staring at the withered leaves, my heart pounding with terrifying clarity. They were not just stealing my money. They were not just keeping me hidden away from the outside world. They were actively chemically inducing dementia. They were destroying my brain to ensure I could never reclaim my life or my $50 million legacy. The golden cage they built for me was actually a slow, quiet execution chamber. The revelation that Diana was actively poisoning me shifted something fundamental deep inside my mind. I was no longer a victim trying to understand how my family could steal my wealth. I was a survivor trapped behind enemy lines. During the daylight hours, I played my part flawlessly. I let my hands shake. I shuffled my feet when I walked down the hallways. I stared blankly out the windows. But when the sun went down, and the heavy oak doors of the mansion clicked shut for the night, the fog lifted. My mind, hardened by over 4,000 days in a federal penitentiary, became razor-sharp. The golden cage they had built for me was about to become my hunting ground. I waited until the grandfather clock in the main foyer chimed 2 times. The low resonant sound echoed through the quiet estate, signaling that it was 2 o'clock in the morning. I knew Edward and Diana were heavy sleepers. I slipped out of my narrow bed. I wore dark clothing and moved barefoot across the cold hardwood floor to avoid making even the slightest sound. The mansion was completely dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. I moved through the shadows with the silent precision of a ghost. Prison had taught me how to walk without being heard. It had taught me how to control my breathing, how to measure my steps, and how to blend into the darkness when the guards made their nightly rounds. My destination was the east wing of the house where Edward had established his grand home office. It used to be my father's library. I reached the heavy mahogany door and wrapped my hand around the brass knob. It was locked just as I expected. Edward was paranoid, but his paranoia was amateurish. He thought a standard cylinder lock would keep his secrets safe. He had no idea what kind of skills a man acquires when he is locked in a cage with professional thieves. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 small, rigid pieces of metal. I had fashioned them earlier that day from a thick paperclip and the metal backing of a disposable razor. I slid the makeshift tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole, applying a feather-light pressure with my thumb. Then, I inserted the pick, gently feeling for the binding pins inside the mechanism. One by one, I manipulated the pins. The lock surrendered with a soft, satisfying snap. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, slipping inside before easing it shut behind me. The office smelled of rich leather and expensive cigars. I moved straight to the massive oak desk sitting in the center of the room. Edward always preferred to work from home when dealing with sensitive matters. I pressed the power button on his sleek, modern desktop computer. The screen flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across my face. A password prompt appeared on the screen. I stood there for a moment, analyzing my brother's mindset. Edward was a man defined by his boundless arrogance. I knew he would not use a complex, randomized string of characters. He would use something familiar, something that validated his ego. I thought about the purebred golden retriever he had bought shortly after I went to prison, a dog he paraded around like a trophy. I placed my fingers on the quiet keyboard and typed the dog's name, followed by the year he bought the estate. I pressed the enter key. The system unlocked immediately. I was inside. I began scanning through the directories, looking for anything hidden beneath the surface. Edward was a financial officer, which meant he was meticulous with numbers, but he was not an information technology expert. It did not take me long to find a hidden partition on the hard drive. I opened the folder and found dozens of meticulously organized digital ledgers. As I opened the spreadsheets and began to analyze the data, my blood ran cold. The magnitude of his betrayal was far worse than I had ever imagined. Edward had not just stolen my money and drained my retirement accounts. He had completely repurposed Caldwell Tech. He was using the legitimate corporate infrastructure of my life's work to create a massive international money laundering syndicate. The ledgers documented millions upon millions of dollars flowing in from dummy corporations located in South America and Eastern Europe. The money was being funneled through Caldwell Tech's operational expenses, disguised as consulting fees and software licensing acquisitions. Then the clean money was wired out to offshore accounts controlled by a notorious international cartel. Edward was washing dirty money for some of the most dangerous criminals on the planet. And the most terrifying part was how he structured the paperwork. He was still using my name, my digital signatures, and my legacy credentials as the ultimate safeguard. If the federal authorities ever launched an investigation into these new transactions, the paper trail would lead directly back to me. He was setting me up to take the fall for a second time. My hands gripped the edge of the desk. The sheer scale of his malice was breathtaking. But I needed more. I needed to know exactly how it all started. I kept digging through the hidden partitions, scrolling past the recent cartel transactions. At the very bottom of the directory, I noticed an encrypted folder labeled simply as the 2014 archive. The encryption was basic, likely a remnant of older software he never bothered to update. I bypassed it using a common directory override command. The folder unzipped and the contents spilled across the screen. I stopped breathing. There, displayed in high definition, were the original unedited financial documents that had been used to secure my conviction. I opened a subfolder and found raw, uncompressed image files of my forged signature. I saw the digital traces showing exactly how Edward had manipulated the company's internal servers to make it look like I was the one authorizing the illegal corporate transfers. He had painstakingly crafted the entire illusion, covering his own tracks while painting a giant target on my back. But that was not the discovery that shattered my heart. I opened another document titled Witness Preparation Notes. It was a comprehensive, heavily edited script. It contained bullet points, emotional cues, and specific phrasing guidelines. I read through the text and my stomach violently lurched. It was the exact testimony Diana had given on the witness stand during my trial. The words on the screen detailed exactly when she should cry, when she should look away from the jury, and how she should describe my supposed erratic, greedy behavior. They had rehearsed my destruction. They had sat in this very house, perhaps at this very desk, and choreographed the exact performance that would convince the judge to lock me away for 2 decades. Diana was not a coerced participant. She was the star witness in a calculated execution. I was not fighting for my money anymore. I was now fighting to completely and utterly avenge the 12 years of my life they had stolen. I could not fight alone. The mansion walls were closing in, and every piece of technology inside was tightly monitored. If I accessed the internet, Edward's software would flag my activity. I was trapped on an island of their making. I needed a secure line of communication. To get that, I had to venture past the iron gates. The next morning, I initiated my performance. I shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet, my hands shaking violently. Diana was sipping coffee, watching me with pity and revulsion. I let my jaw hang slack, adopting the hollow gaze of a man losing his grip on reality. I mumbled that my room felt like a prison cell. I told her I just wanted to feel the sun on my face and sit in the local park. Diana sighed, clearly annoyed. Letting the neighbors see a senile old man wandering the streets would solidify their story that prison had destroyed my mind. She agreed, but she was not stupid enough to let me go unmonitored. She called for a man named Leon. He was introduced as a private healthcare aide, but his heavy musculature told a different story. He was a hired thug placed to ensure I never wandered too far. Leon trailed me down the long driveway and onto the quiet sidewalk. He kept a deliberate distance of 30 feet to maintain the illusion of my independence. I walked with an agonizingly slow, unsteady gait. Every step looked like a massive effort. In reality, my muscles were coiled and ready. I scanned the environment for a specific opportunity. We reached the local park. It was a green space filled with oak trees and scattered wooden benches. I spotted my target immediately. A teenage boy was sitting on a stone retaining wall, tapping aggressively on a cheap smartphone. He had a worn skateboard resting against his leg. He probably upgraded his phone frequently and kept his old ones. I shuffled toward a wooden bench near the boy, deliberately stumbling over a crack in the pavement. I let out a loud groan and collapsed onto the bench, clutching my chest. Leon stopped a comfortable distance away, leaning against an oak tree and pulling out his phone, thoroughly bored by his babysitting duty. He looked away for exactly 5 seconds. That was all the time I needed. I leaned toward the teenager, my shaking hands instantly becoming steady. I pulled a crumpled $50 bill from my pocket. It was half the weekly allowance Edward had given me. I looked the boy directly in the eye. I pointed to the older, cracked mobile phone resting next to him. I whispered sharply, offering him the $50 for the old device. The boy looked surprised, but $50 was an easy trade for junk plastic. He snatched the cash and kicked the phone toward my foot. In one seamless motion, I slid the device under the sole of my shoe. When Leon looked up, I was simply massaging my knee. I waited 10 minutes, establishing a rhythm of mundane inactivity. Leon eventually lost interest again, turning to light a cigarette. I slipped the phone from my shoe and hid it within the folds of my oversized jacket. I turned it on. The battery was at 14%. Any deactivated mobile phone can still connect to public wireless networks. I quickly connected to the unsecured network of a nearby coffee shop. I opened an encrypted messaging application. I did not need an address book. Over the past 12 years, I had memorized a single sequence of numbers. It was the contact information for Harrison Wright. Harrison was my former corporate attorney, a fiercely loyal man who had fought to defend me during my trial. Because he refused to bend to Edward's manipulations, Edward orchestrated a vicious smear campaign against him, framing him for ethical violations that got him disbarred. Harrison lost his prestigious career because he stood by me. I knew he was currently working as a paralegal in a rundown office, barely making ends meet. I dialed his number. The line rang 3 times before a tired voice answered. "Wright speaking," the voice said, sounding exhausted. I cupped my hand over my mouth, keeping my head bowed so Leon could not see my lips moving. "Harrison," I whispered, my voice steady. "It is Richard." There was a sharp intake of breath. The silence stretched for a long moment as Harrison processed the sound of my voice. When he finally spoke, the exhaustion in his tone was gone, replaced by vibrating intensity. Richard Harrison breathed. "They said you were out. I have been waiting for a signal. I knew you would not fade away." "They think I am a broken, demented old man," I whispered. "They think they have me locked in a cage. But I found the ledgers. I found the archive. I know exactly what Edward did and who helped him. The hunt is on." I heard a chair scraping against the floor on his end. "Tell me what you need, boss. I have been waiting 12 years to tear that arrogant bastard down. Just give me the word, and I will burn his fraudulent empire to the ground. I need you to prepare the contingencies we discussed during your last visit to the prison," I instructed. "But I need to know his current operational timeline. What is his immediate objective?" Harrison's voice dropped an octave, turning deadly serious. "You need to move fast, Richard. I still have reliable contacts operating quietly inside the financial district. They have been feeding me whispers about Caldwell Tech. Edward is not just laundering money for the cartel anymore. He is trying to cash out and wash his hands of the operation." "What do you mean?" I asked, my eyes darting toward Leon, who was checking his wristwatch. "He is finalizing a corporate acquisition," Harrison warned. "Edward has brokered a deal to sell Caldwell Tech to a European conglomerate. The buyers are heavily insulated, likely another front for his illicit associates. The buyout is structured for $300 million in clean, untraceable capital. Once he signs that company over, he and Diana will take the money and vanish into a non-extradition country. You will be left holding an empty shell." "When is the deal scheduled to close?" I demanded, feeling a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. "By the end of this month," Harrison replied grimly. "You have less than 3 weeks before he legally transfers ownership and disappears with everything you built. If he gets that signature on the transfer deed, the European buyers will liquidate the assets, dismantle the infrastructure, and bury the evidence." I stared silently at the dry, dead grass beneath my feet, calculating the precise geometry of my next move. The ticking clock had just been introduced to the board. Just 3 weeks. I had exactly 3 weeks to dismantle a criminal enterprise, expose my treacherous brother, and exact my vengeance before they vanished forever. "I will be completely ready," I promised him very quietly, terminating the secure connection and carefully slipping the cheap mobile phone back into my heavy shoe. "I will be completely ready," I promised him very quietly, terminating the secure connection and carefully slipping the cheap mobile phone back into my heavy shoe. That evening, the grand dining room felt suffocating. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table staring at a bowl of bland soup. Edward sat at the head carving a thick steak with the precision of a man who believed he owned the world. Diana sat across from him elegantly sipping red wine. They talked about trivial things, treating me like invisible furniture. But I knew Edward perfectly. I knew the specific cadence of his voice when he was preparing a trap. He wiped his mouth, took a slow sip of wine, and turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and devoid of genuine empathy. He smiled warmly, the kind of smile a predator gives its prey just before the strike. Richard Edward began, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. I know the transition back to civilian life has been overwhelming. We just want you to focus entirely on resting. However, there is a very minor piece of paperwork we need to clear up tonight to ensure your absolute protection. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, sliding it across the polished surface until it rested next to my bowl. I looked down. My vision was slightly blurred from Diana's toxic tea, but I did not need perfect eyesight to understand what I was looking at. The bold, black letters at the top of the page spelled out a full liability waiver and rights relinquishment. I want you to know this is merely a formality, Edward continued smoothly. Because federal regulators are sniffing around our offshore trust, our legal team highly recommends that you formally separate yourself from the corporate entity. If you sign this, you legally surrender any future claim to Caldwell Tech. You will be completely destitute, meaning they can never harass you for financial restitution. You will be entirely safe, and Diana and I will continue caring for you. I stared at the document. This was the final nail in my coffin. This was the exact piece of paper Edward needed to execute the $300 million buyout with his European cartel associates. Without my signature, the buyers would never risk inheriting a legal dispute. He needed me to willingly hand over the keys to the kingdom. I let my hands begin to shake. I widened my eyes, adopting a look of profound, senile confusion. I reached out and touched the edge of the paper, my fingers trembling violently. Edward I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy. I do not understand. Caldwell Tech is my life. I built it from nothing. Why do I have to sign away my name? Can we not just wait a little longer? I feel so confused lately. My head is always so cloudy. The warm smile vanished from Edward's face, replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. He opened his mouth to speak, but Diana beat him to it. The sweet, angelic facade she had maintained completely shattered. She placed her wineglass down on the table with a sharp, aggressive thud. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany surface, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, venomous intensity. Richard, honey, Diana said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You need to listen to us carefully. The doctors have been clear. They say your mind is slipping fast. The trauma of prison accelerated your cognitive decline. We see it every day. You shuffle around the house, you cannot remember simple conversations, and your hands will not stop shaking. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing right through my soul. If you do not sign this paperwork to protect the family, Edward and I might have to seek a full medical conservatorship. If the state deems you mentally unfit, you will not be staying in this lovely house anymore. You would not want to spend your final years locked away in a sterile psychiatric ward strapped to a bed forgotten by the world, would you? The sheer brutality of her threat hung heavily in the air. She was holding a loaded gun to my freedom. They were fully prepared to have me legally declared insane and locked in an asylum. I knew exactly what I had to do. I let out a loud, pathetic gasp. I deliberately dropped my silver soup spoon. It clattered against the porcelain bowl and tumbled onto the floor. I pulled my hands back, pressing them against my chest as if terrified. I let my entire body shake, playing the role of the broken old man. Please, I whimpered, staring at the document with wide, fearful eyes. Please, Diana. Do not send me away to a hospital. I cannot go back to a cage. I cannot be locked up again. I will sign the paper. Edward let out a quiet breath of relief. His arrogant smile returned instantly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold pen, extending it toward me. "That is a smart decision, Richard," he said soothingly. "Just sign on the dotted line and your worries will disappear forever." I reached for the pen, but then violently pulled my hand back, shaking my head rapidly. I forced a look of stubborn senility onto my face, grasping at a fabricated sense of pride. "No," I stammered, my voice rising in a frantic plea. "Not here. Not in the dark. Caldwell Tech was my entire life. If I have to sign it away, I will not do it secretly like a criminal. I want to say goodbye properly." Edward frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Richard, just sign the paper. Next week is the 30th anniversary of the company," I blurted out, trembling with manic persistence. "You are hosting the grand anniversary gala." "I know you are. If I am giving up my life's work, I want to do it there. I want to stand on a stage one last time. I will sign your paper in front of everyone to say a proper goodbye to my legacy. If you do not let me do this one last thing, I will not sign it." The room fell silent. Edward and Diana exchanged a calculating look. Having the founder publicly sign away his rights at a corporate gala would be the ultimate public relations victory. It would legitimize his ownership for the European buyers. It was an erratic demand from a broken man, but it served his sinister agenda perfectly. Edward lowered the gold pen. He looked at me with profound pity and absolute triumph. "If that is what it takes to give you peace, Richard," he said softly, "then we will do it your way. You will sign the relinquishment at the gala next week." I lowered my head, burying my face in my trembling hands, acting as though I were weeping over the loss of my empire. But behind my fingers, hidden from their treacherous eyes, my lips curled into a cold, dangerous smile. The trap was set. They had absolutely no idea. "I will be completely ready," I promised him very quietly, terminating the secure connection and carefully slipping the cheap mobile phone back into my heavy shoe. The slow walk back to the expansive estate felt entirely different from my earlier trip. Every single step I took was fueled by a cold, burning purpose. I finally had a definitive timeline. 3 short weeks to systematically dismantle the fortress my brother had built on top of my stolen legacy. When I returned to the mansion, I immediately resumed my performance. I shuffled through the grand foyer, my shoulders slumped, my eyes fixed firmly on the polished floor. I let my left hand tremble just enough to be visible to the security cameras. The golden cage was closing in on me, but they had absolutely no idea I had just acquired the key to lock them inside it. That evening, the grand dining room felt suffocating. The massive mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield. I sat at the far end, staring down at a bowl of bland soup. Edward sat at the head of the table, carving a thick piece of steak with the aggressive precision of a man who believed he owned the world. Diana sat across from him, elegantly sipping a glass of dark red wine. They carried on a conversation about trivial social events, completely ignoring my presence. But I knew Edward perfectly. He wiped his mouth, took a slow sip of wine, and turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of any genuine human empathy. Richard Edward began, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. "I know the transition back to civilian life has been overwhelming for you. However, there is a very minor piece of paperwork we need to clear up tonight to ensure your absolute protection." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a neatly folded document. He slid it across the polished wooden surface until it rested right next to my soup bowl. The bold, black letters at the very top of the page spelled out a full liability waiver and rights relinquishment. "I want you to know this is merely a simple formality," Edward continued smoothly, "because federal regulators are still aggressively sniffing around our offshore trust. Our legal team highly recommends that you formally separate yourself from the corporate entity once and for all. If you sign this document, you legally surrender any future claim to Caldwell Tech and its holdings. You will be legally classified as completely destitute, which means the government can never harass you for financial restitution. You will be safe and Diana and I will continue caring for you for the rest of your life." I stared at the thick white paper. This was the exact piece of paper Edward needed to execute the $300 million buyout with his European cartel associates. Without my verifiable signature relinquishing all rights, the buyers would never risk inheriting a massive legal dispute from the original founder. He needed me to willingly hand over the keys to the kingdom. I let my hands begin to shake. I widened my eyes, adopting a look of profound, senile confusion. I reached out and touched the edge of the paper, my fingers trembling violently against the table. "Edward." I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy, deliberately slurring my words slightly. "I do not understand. Caldwell Tech is my life. I built it from nothing. Why do I have to sign away my name? Can we not just wait a little longer? I feel so confused lately." The warm, brotherly smile vanished from Edward's face in an instant, replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. He opened his mouth to speak, but Diana beat him to it. The sweet, angelic facade she had maintained for weeks completely shattered. She slammed her crystal wineglass down on the table with a sharp, aggressive thud. Her eyes locked onto mine with a cold, venomous intensity. "Richard, honey," Diana said. Her voice dropped to a dangerous, hissing whisper. "You need to listen to us very carefully. The doctors have been exceptionally clear about your prognosis. They say your mind is slipping fast. The severe trauma of federal prison accelerated your cognitive decline. We see it every single day. You cannot remember simple conversations, and your hands will not stop shaking." She tilted her head, her gaze piercing right through my soul. "If you do not sign this paperwork tonight to protect the family, Edward and I might have to seek a full medical conservatorship. If the state deems you mentally unfit to make your own decisions, you will not be staying in this lovely house anymore. You would not want to spend your final years locked away in a sterile psychiatric ward strapped to a bed, forgotten by the rest of the world. Would you?" The sheer brutality of her threat hung heavily in the stale air. She was holding a loaded gun directly to my freedom. They were fully prepared to have me legally declared insane and locked in a medical asylum if I resisted. I knew exactly what I had to do. I let out a loud, pathetic gasp. I deliberately dropped my heavy silver soup spoon. It clattered against the porcelain bowl and tumbled onto the hardwood floor. I pulled my hands back, pressing them tightly against my chest. I let my entire body shake, playing the role of the broken, frightened old man to absolute perfection. "Please," I whimpered, staring at the document with wide eyes. "Please, Diana. Do not send me to a hospital. I cannot go back to a cage. I will sign the paper." Edward let out a breath of relief. His arrogant smile returned. He pulled a gold pen from his pocket, extending it across the table. "That is a smart decision, Richard," he said. "Just sign your name on the dotted line." I reached for the pen, but violently pulled my hand back, shaking my head rapidly. I forced a look of stubborn senility onto my face. "No," I stammered frantically. "Not here. Not in the dark. Caldwell Tech was my entire life. If I have to sign it away, I will not do it secretly, like a hidden criminal. I want to say goodbye properly." Edward frowned in irritation. "What are you talking about, Richard? Just sign the paper." "Next week is the 30th anniversary of the company," I blurted out, trembling. "You are hosting the anniversary gala. If I am giving up my life's work, I want to do it there. I want to stand on a stage one last time. I will sign your paper in front of everyone to say a proper goodbye to my legacy. If you do not let me do this one last thing, I will not sign it." The dining room fell into a calculating silence. Edward and Diana exchanged a long look. Having the founder publicly sign away his rights at a massive corporate gala would be the ultimate public relations victory. It would legitimize his ownership entirely for the buyers. It was an erratic demand from a broken man, but it served his sinister agenda perfectly. Edward slowly lowered the heavy gold pen back to the polished mahogany table. He looked at me with profound pity and absolute triumph. "If that is what it takes to give you peace, Richard," he said softly, "then we will do it your way. You will sign the relinquishment at the gala next week." I lowered my head, burying my face in my trembling hands, acting as though I were weeping over the devastating loss of my entire empire. But hidden safely behind my fingers, my lips curled into a cold, dangerous smile. The trap was finally set. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The trap was finally set. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The following morning, Edward announced a mandatory medical evaluation before the corporate transfer could be legally finalized. A private phlebotomist arrived at the estate. It was Harrison disguised in crisp blue medical scrubs and a white surgical mask. Playing the bored professional to perfection, he instructed me to walk to the guest bathroom. Diana watched us from the hallway like a hawk, but she did not follow us inside. As the door shut, Harrison turned on the sink faucet to mask our voices. He drew a small vial of my blood to make the visit look legitimate. Applying a bandage, he reached into his case and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen and a tiny flesh-colored earpiece. He pressed them firmly into my palm. "The pen has a specialized ink cartridge," Harrison whispered. "The ink will completely vanish within 24 hours of touching paper. The earpiece is synced to a secure frequency. Wear it at the gala." And Richard. I finally got through to my contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The trap is primed. If Edward catches on before you use that pen, you will be legally locked in an asylum before dawn. I nodded, slipping this pen and earpiece into my pocket. Harrison packed his case, turned off the faucet, and escorted me out. Diana inspected my bandaged arm, satisfied. Harrison left the estate, leaving me completely alone in the lion's den once again. The days leading up to the anniversary gala were an exercise in psychological torture. Edward and Diana grew increasingly paranoid as the buyout date approached. They wanted to ensure my mind was entirely broken before they put me on a stage in front of the cameras. Diana doubled her efforts. She began visiting my room twice a day with her steaming cups of toxic chamomile tea. She would stand over me, her eyes cold and demanding, refusing to leave the room until I finished every drop. I had to adapt immediately. I could no longer simply pour the tea into a potted plant while she was watching. I mastered the dangerous art of palming the neurotoxic pills she had crushed into the liquid. I would take a sip, hold the bitter fluid in the back of my throat, and pretend to swallow while letting the dissolved sediment slide into a small tissue hidden in my cupped hand. It was a terrifying high-stakes performance. If I swallowed even a fraction of the heavy dosage she was administering, my mind would actually shatter. I spent hours alone in my room scrubbing my tongue and rinsing my mouth to purge the poison. I maintained my facade, letting my hands shake and my eyes wander, giving them exactly the hollow, broken man they desperately wanted to see. Edward's arrogance swelled to unbearable heights that week. He began parading the so-called European investors through the estate. I knew exactly who these men were. They were high-level representatives for the cartel dressed in tailored Italian suits to masquerade as legitimate businessmen. Edward would lead them into the grand dining room, offering them my expensive cigars and pouring my rare scotch. He would point to me sitting quietly in the corner, introducing me as his tragic senile brother who had lost his grip on reality after prison. The men would look at me with mocking pity, laughing loudly at Edward's cruel jokes. I sat there in silence, biting the inside of my cheek, absorbing every insult and memorizing every single face in that room. The breaking point arrived 2 days before the gala. The cartel representatives had just left the estate, and Edward was soaring on a wave of pure adrenaline. He poured himself another glass of bourbon and walked into the living room where I was sitting by the fireplace. He stood in front of the roaring fire, admiring his reflection in the large ornate mirror hanging above the mantel. He slowly unclasped my father's vintage watch from his wrist. He held the gold timepiece up to the light, turning it over in his hands, with a look of profound smugness. He placed the watch deliberately on the center of the mantel, right next to a framed photograph of our family from 20 years ago. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with decades of suppressed jealousy and toxic resentment. "You know, Richard," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "the old man always preferred the weaker son. He gave you the company. He gave you the watch. He treated you like the golden child while I did all the heavy lifting in the background. But look at us now. Look at where his precious golden child ended up. You are a broken convict waiting to be locked in a madhouse, and I am about to become one of the wealthiest men in the country." The world always corrects its mistakes eventually. The sheer audacity of his words sent a blinding flash of rage through my entire body. I wanted to leap out of my chair. I wanted to wrap my hands around his throat and squeeze the life out of him. I had to bite down on my tongue so hard that the metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. I forced myself to look down at the floor, letting my shoulders tremble, playing the defeated coward. I swallowed my blood and my pride, reminding myself that true justice requires absolute, unwavering patience. Finally, the night of the gala arrived. The atmosphere in the mansion was electric with nervous energy. Diana stormed into my room carrying a garment bag. She threw it aggressively onto my bed. She had deliberately chosen an ill-fitting, outdated tuxedo from the back of my closet. The jacket was 2 sizes too big, and the trousers hung loosely around my ankles. She wanted me to look as pathetic and diminished as humanly possible when I stepped onto that stage. She wanted the world to see a man who had completely given up. I dressed slowly, letting my hands fumble with the buttons. Diana stepped closely into my personal space to adjust my collar. She aggressively pinned a white boutonniere to my wide lapel, the sharp pin grazing my chest. She grabbed my chin, forcing my face up so I was looking directly into her cold, merciless eyes. "Smile for the cameras tonight, old man," she hissed, her breath hot against my face. "Do exactly what we practiced. You walk up those stairs, you sign your name on that paper, and you smile. Because after tonight, you officially cease to exist." I looked back at her, letting my jaw tremble in fabricated fear. But deep in the pocket of my oversized trousers, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold silver metal of Harrison's fountain pen. I was more than ready now. 12 long years of absolute isolation had hardened my soul into unbreakable steel. I took a deep, silent breath, steadying my racing, pounding heart. They thought they were sending me to the slaughter, but I was leading them to the gallows. "Tonight, you officially cease to exist." The venomous words from Diana's lips echoed in my mind as the limousine ride to the Plaza Hotel began. The interior of the car was suffocatingly quiet. Diana sat directly across from me, her posture rigid, her eyes coldly assessing my deliberately disheveled appearance. I stared out the tinted window at the passing city lights, letting my jaw hang slack to complete the sad illusion. When the doors of the luxury vehicle opened, a storm of camera flashes erupted into the crisp New York night. I gripped the wooden handle of my heavy cane, forcing my knuckles to tremble as I hoisted myself out of the back seat. The reporters shouted my name, their voices a deafening blend of morbid curiosity and predatory excitement. I hunched my shoulders forward, shrinking away from the bright flashing lights like a terrified, broken animal. I shuffled my feet across the long red carpet, dragging the rubber tip of my cane against the fabric to emphasize my fabricated frailty. Diana stepped out of the car right behind me, instantly transforming into the tragic, fiercely protective wife. She placed a gentle, guiding hand on the small of my back, shielding me from the aggressive press, while offering the cameras a perfectly manufactured smile of deep, weary sorrow. Every single step toward the grand brass doors was a meticulously calculated performance. I let my breathing grow ragged and shallow, painting the exact picture of a ruined convict who was entirely lost in a world that had quickly moved on without him. We stepped inside the opulent foyer, and the doors sealed out the shouting reporters. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in tailored black tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. These were the industry elites, the corporate titans, and the powerful investors who had once courted my favor and begged for my business. 12 years ago, when the federal agents raided my offices, every single one of these people had immediately abandoned me. They had deleted my number, canceled our lucrative contracts, and publicly condemned me to save their own fragile reputations. Now, as I shuffled through the crowded room, the sea of elegant guests parted before me. Conversations abruptly stopped. I felt the suffocating weight of their stares pressing down on my hunched shoulders. I saw the unmistakable glint of pity in their eyes, quickly followed by quiet disgust. They were looking at a ghost, a miserable cautionary tale of corporate greed, who had spent over a decade rotting in a concrete cell. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the intricate geometric patterns of the polished marble floor, refusing to make eye contact with the cowards who had left me to die. I let my hands shake visibly as we moved through the quiet crowd, feeding their arrogant assumptions. They truly thought I was a pathetic, senile old man who deserved his tragic fate. They had absolutely no idea that the frail convict shuffling past them was quietly cataloging every single face in the room, preparing to burn their entire corrupt ecosystem to the ground. At the far end of the grand ballroom, holding court near the expansive stage, was my brother. Edward looked like a king. He wore a custom-tailored suit, and my father's vintage watch gleamed brightly on his wrist as he shook hands with a group of 4 distinct men. They were introduced to the room as prominent European investors, the wealthy saviors who were supposedly injecting $300 million of clean capital into Caldwell Tech. But I knew exactly who they were. I recognized the dead expressions in their eyes and the aggressive, disciplined way they stood together. These were not venture capitalists. They were high-level financial fixers for an international cartel, dressed up in expensive silk and imported leather to finalize the ultimate money laundering transaction. Edward clapped one of the men on the back, laughing loudly at a shared joke projecting the image of a masterful corporate visionary. The room quieted down as the overhead lights dimmed. Edward smoothly excused himself from the cartel representatives and walked up the stairs to the grand stage. He stepped up to the clear crystal podium, adjusting the microphone with arrogant ease. A massive digital screen behind him displayed the 30-year anniversary logo of the company I had built with my own 2 hands. Edward cleared his throat, and his voice echoed softly through the expansive ballroom. He delivered a sickeningly sweet, deeply hypocritical speech. He spoke extensively about the severe challenges of the past decade, the heavy burden of executive leadership, and the painful necessity of guiding a family legacy through times of profound darkness. He spoke of my lengthy incarceration with feigned sorrow, calling it a highly tragic chapter that had finally come to a peaceful end. He painted himself as the tireless, devoted guardian of the Caldwell name, the loyal brother who had sacrificed absolutely everything to protect my original vision from complete destruction. The audience listened with rapt attention, completely captivated by his truly masterful performance. He concluded his lengthy speech by announcing the bright dawn of a new era, a massive corporate buyout that would securely cement the company's future for generations to come. But before we finalized this historic transition, Edward said, his voice dropping to a reverent, emotional whisper, "I want to formally honor the man who started it all. He has suffered greatly, and his mind is not what it used to be, but he is here tonight to give us his final blessing. Please help me welcome my brother, Richard Caldwell." The massive ballroom erupted into polite, restrained applause. Edward extended his hand toward me, gesturing for me to join him on the brightly lit stage. Beside me, Diana's gentle, guiding hand suddenly turned into a rigid iron vise. Her sharp, manicured fingers dug painfully into my bicep through the thin fabric of my oversized tuxedo jacket. She gripped my arm with terrifying strength, forcefully marching me forward through the parting crowd. I leaned heavily on my wooden cane, dragging my feet across the thick carpet, making every agonizing step look like a monumental, exhausting physical effort. Diana guided me toward the short flight of stairs leading up to the stage. I stumbled deliberately on the first step, letting out a soft, pathetic gasp for the nearby guests to hear. She hauled me upward, her painted smile never faltering for the flashing cameras, though her brutal grip felt exactly like a shackle pulling a condemned man to the gallows. I reached the top of the stairs and shuffled slowly toward the podium. There, resting directly under the bright, harsh glare of a single overhead spotlight, was a very thick stack of legal documents. It was the final $300 million relinquishment contract. It was the exact piece of paper designed to legally erase my entire existence and hand my empire over to ruthless criminals. I stared down at the crisp white pages, my body trembling uncontrollably for the captivated audience, while my mind locked securely onto the cold, heavy silver fountain pen hidden safely inside my dark jacket pocket. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom pressed against my chest like a massive physical weight. I stood at the clear crystal podium looking out over the sea of expectant faces. The flashing camera lights momentarily ceased, as if the entire room was holding its collective breath. To my immediate left stood a state-appointed notary, a stern-looking woman holding an official leather-bound folio. She was there to legally verify that I was of sound mind, or at least sound enough to sign away the remaining rights to my own life. To my right stood Edward. My brother was practically vibrating with barely contained euphoria. His eyes were wide, gleaming with a greedy, undeniable triumph that he could not mask. He had waited 12 long years for this exact moment. He had destroyed my reputation, stolen my wealth, and poisoned my tea, all to reach this specific finish line. Edward took a deliberate step toward me. He reached into his custom-tailored tuxedo and pulled out a heavy gold pen. It was the same pen my father had used to sign the original incorporation papers for the family business decades ago. Edward held the pen out to me, positioning it so the cameras could capture the poetic, tragic transfer of power. He wanted the world to see the broken founder using the family heirloom to surrender his legacy. He placed the tip of the pen near the thick stack of legal documents resting on the podium. Richard Edward said, his voice projecting a fake, soothing warmth for the audience. "It is time. Just sign your name on the marked lines and you can finally rest." I stared at the gold pen. I let my breathing become erratic and shallow. I raised my right hand, allowing my fingers to tremble so violently that they seemed incapable of holding anything. I reached toward his offered hand, but then I stopped. I pulled my hand back, shaking my head with a slow, exaggerated motion of stubborn senility. I reached into the dark pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy silver metal of the specialized fountain pen Harrison had smuggled to me. I slowly pulled it out, gripping it with two shaking hands to keep it from slipping. "I prefer to use my own," I mumbled shakily, ensuring my voice cracked just enough to sound pathetic. Edward frowned, a flash of genuine annoyance crossing his polished features. He glanced at the silver pen in my hand. He did not recognize it, but he did not care enough to argue. He just wanted the signature. He offered a tight, condescending smile and stepped back, gesturing grandly toward the paperwork. "Have it your way, Richard," he replied smoothly. "As long as you sign the documents." I turned my attention to the thick stack of contracts. The bright overhead spotlight beat down on the crisp white paper. I could see the dotted lines waiting for my name. I knew exactly what this ink was designed to do. Harrison had engineered it perfectly. The chemical composition of the ink would bind to the paper for exactly 24 hours, looking completely legitimate to the notary and the buyers. But the moment it was exposed to the ambient air for a full day, the molecular structure would entirely break down. The ink would evaporate without a single trace. By tomorrow night, the $300 million relinquishment contract would be nothing more than a stack of blank, worthless paper. I bent over the podium. I leaned my weight heavily onto my left arm, keeping my wooden cane propped awkwardly against my hip. I positioned the silver fountain pen over the first dotted line. I made sure to let my hand tremble violently for the cameras. The press needed to see a man struggling to control his own motor functions. I let the silver tip hover above the paper, shaking back and forth. But the moment the metal nib touched the surface of the document, the trembling stopped entirely. My mind locked into a state of absolute, unbreakable focus. I executed my signature absolutely perfectly. It was the strong, decisive signature of the man who had built Caldwell Tech from a garage into a global empire. I moved to the second page, then the third. I signed away my patents. I signed away my voting rights. I signed away my corporate equity. Each time I finished a page, I let my hand resume its violent shaking, ensuring the illusion remained flawless. The entire process took 3 agonizing minutes. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the scratching of the metal nib against the thick paper. When I finally reached the last page and applied the final stroke of my name, I let out a loud shuddering sigh. I dropped the silver fountain pen onto the podium, letting it clatter loudly against the glass. I slumped backward, gripping my wooden cane with both hands, looking like a man who had just run a grueling marathon and collapsed at the finish line. Edward did not waste a single second. The moment the pen left my hand, he lunged forward. He snatched the thick stack of papers off the podium with the aggressive speed of a starving animal. He did not even let the notary inspect the pages first. He held the signed contracts up in the air, grasping them like a hard-won championship trophy. He turned to the crowd, his face beaming with absolute unadulterated victory. The grand ballroom responded immediately. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. The cartel representatives sitting in the front row nodded in quiet satisfaction, knowing their massive money laundering operation was now legally insulated. The photographers snapped hundreds of pictures capturing the triumphant new owner and the defeated, ruined founder standing weakly in the background. Diana stepped up onto the stage, joining Edward in the spotlight. She wrapped her arm around his waist, smiling radiantly for the press. They had won. They had successfully navigated every obstacle, poisoned my mind, stolen my wealth, and legally secured their $300 million exit strategy. Diana leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes in sheer relief. The nightmare of my return was finally over for them. They had pulled off the ultimate corporate heist right in front of the entire world, and no one suspected a single thing. They were completely and absolutely untouchable now. Edward lowered the papers and turned his back to the cheering audience. He stepped close to me, maintaining a warm, brotherly smile for the cameras. But as he leaned in to embrace me, his mouth pressed directly against my ear. His voice dropped to a vicious, mocking whisper that only I could hear. "Thanks for the company, loser," Edward hissed, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon. "The men in white coats are waiting for you at the back exit. Have a nice life in the psych ward." He pulled away from me, giving my shoulder a firm, patronizing pat. He turned back to the microphone, raising his hands to quiet the applauding crowd. He prepared to deliver his grand concluding remarks, ready to officially dismiss me from the stage and out of his life forever. But instead of walking away, I stand up straight. The fabricated weakness in my legs vanished instantly. I drew myself up to full height, towering over the podium, with the commanding presence I suppressed for 12 years. I loosened my grip on the heavy wooden cane. I did not need it anymore today. I let it slip from my fingers. I tossed my cane off the stage. The solid wood hit the marble floor below with a violent thud. The heavy thud echoes through the ballroom. The heavy thud echoes through the ballroom. The sound of the solid wood hitting the polished marble floor was like a gunshot cutting through the polite applause. Every eye in the cavernous room snapped toward the stage. They expected to see a frail, broken man collapsing under the immense weight of his tragic life. They expected to see the defeated founder of Caldwell Tech crumbling into a pathetic heap of sorrow and regret. But that is not what they saw. The fabricated weakness that had consumed my muscles for the past 3 weeks vanished in an absolute instant. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin high. The stooped, shuffling posture of a heavily sedated convict evaporated, replaced by the towering, unyielding presence of a man who had forged a $50 million empire from scratch. I stepped forward. I did not drag my feet. My stride was long, powerful, and brimming with a terrifying, suppressed energy. Edward was standing right next to the crystal podium, his arrogant smile frozen on his face as he tried to comprehend the sudden, impossible transformation happening right before his eyes. He opened his mouth to whisper something to me, probably another vicious insult to keep me in line. But before he could even form the first syllable, I raised my arm. I did not strike him. I simply planted my hand firmly against his chest and pushed him aside. The physical strength behind my movement shocked him completely. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the smooth stage floor, nearly losing his balance entirely. I stepped into his place, gripping the edges of the clear crystal podium with rock-solid, perfectly steady hands. The bright overhead spotlight washed over my face. I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Edward," I said. My voice did not shake. It did not crack or waver with senile confusion. It rang out through the massive speakers, deep, sharp, and commanding, vibrating, with the absolute authority I had buried for 12 long years. The sound of my true voice hit the audience like a physical blow. The polite applause died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, bewildered silence. I stared directly at the front row, locking eyes with the 4 men in tailored Italian suits who were pretending to be European venture capitalists. But before the buyers wire $300 million into your offshore accounts, I believe they should know exactly what they are actually purchasing today. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded ballroom. The corporate titans and industry elites exchanged nervous, confused glances. The cartel representatives in the front row stiffened their relaxed posture, instantly turning rigid and predatory. They knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong with their perfect money laundering transaction. Edward recovered his balance and lunged back toward the podium, his face flushed with sudden, frantic panic. "Richard, stop this right now," Edward hissed, keeping his voice low enough to avoid the microphone, though the sheer terror in his eyes spoke volumes. He reached out to grab my arm desperately, trying to pull me away from the center of the stage. I simply shifted my weight and blocked him with my shoulder, standing like an immovable wall of solid granite. Edward realized he could not physically move me without causing a massive, humiliating spectacle in front of the flashing press cameras. He frantically reached for the small control panel resting on the edge of the podium, his fingers slamming down on the main mute button to cut the audio feed. He pressed it once. He pressed it twice. He hammered his fist against the plastic console. Nothing happened. The microphone remained completely live, picking up the sound of his ragged, panicked breathing and broadcasting it to the entire room. What he did not know was that the audiovisual booth overlooking the grand ballroom was no longer controlled by the hotel staff. Harrison Wright, my fiercely loyal former attorney, had slipped away from the catering staff entrance 10 minutes ago. He was currently sitting in the dark control room, wearing his stolen uniform, having physically locked the main soundboard. Harrison had overridden the podium controls, ensuring that my microphone could not be turned off by anyone on that stage. Edward stared at the glowing green light on the microphone, his mind fracturing, as he realized his technological failsafe had been entirely disabled. When technology failed, Diana decided to intervene. She broke away from her paralyzed stance near the stage stairs and rushed forward, her high heels clicking loudly. She threw herself toward me, abandoning her elegant poise for raw, desperate survival instinct. She waved her arms frantically at the venue security guards stationed around the perimeter of the room. "Guards, get up here right now!" Diana screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the silent ballroom. "Please, you have to help my husband. Grab him and take him out the back doors immediately." She turned to the audience, forcing a look of agonizing, tearful sorrow onto her panicked face. "I am so incredibly sorry, everyone. Please forgive this disruption. Richard is having a severe dementia episode. The prison trauma has completely broken his mind. He does not know where he is or what he is saying. The doctors warned us this psychological break would happen. We need medical professionals right now. Two large security guards in dark suits moved hesitantly toward the stage stairs, unsure of how to proceed. They had been briefed to handle a senile, unpredictable convict, but the man standing at the podium did not look crazy or confused. I looked directly at the approaching guards, raising one hand in a calm, commanding gesture that demanded absolute obedience. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, their instincts telling them not to cross the line. I turned my attention back to the woman who had orchestrated my ruin. Diana was standing 2 feet away, her chest heaving, her eyes silently begging me to collapse and surrender. I looked at the beautiful, treacherous face of the woman I had once loved more than life itself. I remembered the 12 years of isolation. I remembered the forged documents. I remembered the withered, dying fern in the corner of my windowless room. I leaned closer to the microphone. "I do not have dementia, Diana," I roared. The sheer volume and primal fury in my voice shook the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. The sound blasted through the ballroom, stripping away every single lie she had ever told. And I certainly did not drink your toxic chamomile tea loaded with heavy neurotoxins for the past month. Diana recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. The audience erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and frantic whispers. The press cameras began firing rapidly, capturing the exact moment the flawless illusion shattered into a million pieces. Edward backed away, his hands trembling, his brilliant corporate mind failing to comprehend how the dead man he had buried had managed to dig his way out of the grave. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I pulled out a small silver flash drive that Harrison had given me in the bathroom. I held it up high in the air, letting the bright stage spotlight catch the metallic surface so every single person in the room could see it clearly. "We are done with the fairy tales," I said, my voice cutting through the rising chaos like a scythe. "You wanted to celebrate Caldwell Tech tonight. You wanted to sell my legacy to the highest bidder. Let us give the investors exactly what they came for. Let us look at the real Caldwell Tech portfolio." I reached deep into the inner pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket and slowly pulled out the small silver flash drive. I held it up high for the entire room to see a tiny piece of metal that held the absolute destruction of my brother's criminal empire. I did not need to hand it to an audiovisual technician. Harrison had already patched directly into the hotel's main projection system from his locked booth upstairs. I simply gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the tinted glass window at the back of the hall. Instantly, the massive, glowing 30-year anniversary logo of Caldwell Tech vanished from the giant screen behind me. The screen went pitch black for a fraction of a second before roaring back to life with blinding high-definition clarity. It did not show corporate milestones or quarterly profit projections. It displayed pages upon pages of heavily redacted international bank statements, complex offshore routing numbers, and highly classified cartel communications. The documents were magnified to 20 feet tall, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore the reality of what was happening. I pointed at the screen, letting my finger trace the intricate web of illicit wire transfers that Edward had authorized using my forged signature. The thick red arrows on the screen explicitly linked the dummy corporations in South America directly to Caldwell Tech's operational accounts. The raw, unfiltered truth was finally illuminated for all to see. The initial silence in the grand ballroom shattered instantly, replaced by a tidal wave of chaotic, overlapping voices. The wealthy corporate elite who just moments ago had been politely applauding my supposed downfall began shouting in profound confusion and rising horror. Men in tailored tuxedos pointed at the screen, recognizing the sheer magnitude of the financial crimes being displayed before them. Women in evening gowns covered their mouths, backing away from the stage as the dangerous reality of the situation took hold. But the most dramatic reaction came directly from the front row. The four cartel representatives, the dangerous men Edward had proudly paraded as European venture capitalists, completely abandoned their calm, sophisticated disguises. The moment the offshore routing numbers flashed across the giant screen, their faces contorted in genuine panic. They knew instantly that their highly insulated money laundering network had been totally compromised. They did not wait for a detailed explanation. They practically shoved their heavy wooden chairs backward, knocking over crystal champagne flutes and exquisite floral arrangements. They pushed violently through the bewildered crowd of guests, keeping their heads down as they moved with aggressive, trained urgency toward the heavy brass exit doors at the back of the ballroom. They were abandoning Edward completely, leaving him to sink with the massive ship he had so arrogantly steered into a destructive storm. I did not let the momentum fade for a single second. I gripped the edges of the crystal podium and leaned closely into the live microphone. "You wanted a speech about the future of this family legacy," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising panic like a sharpened blade. "Let us listen to the vision my brother and my wife had for my future." I gave Harrison another subtle nod. The giant screen split in half, keeping the financial documents on the left, while a pulsing audio waveform appeared on the right. A sharp crackle of static hissed through the massive state-of-the-art surround sound. Speakers followed immediately by a high-quality, crystal-clear audio playback. It was the exact recording my hidden device had captured on my very first night back in the estate. Edward's arrogant, boastful voice filled the grand ballroom, echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. "I finished the transfer an hour ago," his recorded voice declared proudly. "Every single trace of his liquid assets has been scrubbed, funneled through 3 different shell companies, and deposited into our Swiss account. That 70-year-old convict has absolutely nothing left to his name." The crowd gasped in collective horror. Then Diana's cold, mocking laughter played through the speakers, sounding infinitely more sinister now that her angelic facade had been stripped away entirely. "Good," her recorded voice responded with chilling cruelty. "Let him come home. What is he going to do? He is a disgraced, broke old man. If he shows up here demanding his life back, we will just toss him in some cheap run-down nursing home. We can claim his mind deteriorated in prison. No one will question us. We have the power of attorney." The sheer malice of their own words hung heavily in the air, a definitive confession broadcast to the most powerful people in the city. The effect of the audio recording was absolutely devastating. Diana, who had been standing rigidly near the edge of the stage, seemed to physically shrink as her own cruel words washed over the massive audience. She realized that every prominent socialite, every wealthy investor, and every powerful journalist in the room was staring at her with unvarnished, absolute disgust. The pristine, tragic narrative she had meticulously maintained for 12 long years disintegrated completely in front of her eyes. She let out a weak, agonizing wail that was completely devoid of her usual theatrical polish. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard, polished surface of the stage, her expensive silk evening gown pooling around her shaking legs. She raised her trembling hands, pressing them fiercely against her face, as if she could physically block out the overwhelming shame and the judgmental glares of the crowd. She curled into herself, a broken, pathetic figure, weeping openly on the floor, finally experiencing a tiny fraction of the deep, suffocating humiliation she had so willingly inflicted upon me for over a decade. Edward, however, refused to surrender gracefully. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of perspiration and running down his flushed, panicked face. His eyes darted wildly around the chaotic ballroom, watching his wealthy buyers flee, and his carefully constructed reputation burn to the ground. He spotted a backup microphone resting on a small table near the stage stairs. He lunged for it, gripping the heavy metal stand with white, desperate knuckles. He switched it on, his breathing ragged and incredibly heavy. "It is a fake," Edward screamed into the backup microphone, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "Do not listen to him. The audio is a deep fake. He is a convicted felon trying to ruin a legitimate business transaction." He pointed a trembling finger at me, his chest heaving with every labored breath. He is crazy. He has lost his mind. Besides, it does not matter what he shows you. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out the thick stack of documents I had just signed moments ago. He waved the relinquishment contract wildly in the air above his head, holding it like a desperate shield against the incoming tide of total destruction. He just signed away all his rights on that podium. I have his signature right here. The company is legally mine, and I am finalizing the sale right now. You can never stop me from taking what is absolutely rightfully mine, Richard. Edward stood there panting, holding the relinquishment contract high above his head like a desperate shield against the rising tide of absolute ruin. His chest heaved violently under his custom-tailored tuxedo. He was completely trapped in a corner of his own making, but his massive ego simply would not allow him to surrender. He clutched the backup microphone, his knuckles turning pure white as he scanned the grand ballroom for any sign of support. But there was none. The corporate elites who had worshipped him just 10 minutes ago were now staring at him with profound horror and disgust. Even through the panic, Edward tried to maintain his grip on power. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face slick with heavy perspiration. "He is a convicted felon," Edward screamed, his voice cracking horribly through the speakers. "He forged those documents. He is just trying to extort me because he is broke and jealous. It does not matter. The company is legally mine. I have the signed paperwork right here. I am finalizing the sale right now." I did not raise my voice. I did not even flinch. I simply stood at the crystal podium and looked at my brother with a warm, terrifyingly calm smile. The sheer tranquility of my expression made his frantic ranting look even more pathetic. I reached out and gently tapped the microphone in front of me, ensuring the entire room could hear my next words perfectly. "Edward I," said my tone incredibly gentle and almost conversational. "You have always been so utterly obsessed with the paperwork, but you really should have paid a little more attention to the people sitting at your table. About that contract you are holding. You should probably check the buyers." Edward froze. His frantic eyes darted from my face down to the front row, looking for the 4 sophisticated European venture capitalists who were supposed to save him. Before Edward could even process my words, a deafening crash echoed from the back of the grand ballroom. The heavy gilded brass doors were violently kicked open, slamming against the marble walls with a terrifying force. The polite, refined atmosphere of the corporate gala was instantly obliterated. Dozens of heavily armed tactical agents stormed into the room. They wore dark tactical gear with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission emblazoned across their tactical vests. The sheer volume of their synchronized movement shook the floorboards. "Federal agents." "Nobody move," a booming voice commanded over a heavy megaphone. "Stay exactly where you are and keep your hands visible." The wealthy guests shrieked and scattered, pressing their backs against the floral-decorated walls, completely terrified by the sudden invasion of federal tactical units. But the true shock came from the very front row. The 4 men in expensive Italian suits, the men Edward had proudly introduced as prominent European investors, did not run for the exits. Instead, they moved with lethal, coordinated precision. They reached under their tailored jackets and simultaneously drew heavy, dark firearms. They ripped thick metal badges from their interior pockets and let them hang from heavy chains around their necks. They were not cartel representatives. They were deep-cover federal agents. The lead undercover agent, a tall, imposing man with sharp eyes, vaulted over the VIP table and marched directly toward the stage stairs. His weapon was pointed squarely at the floor, but his posture radiated absolute, undeniable authority. Edward staggered backward, completely paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare. The relinquishment contract slipped slightly in his sweaty grip. He looked at the armed agents, then at Diana weeping on the floor, and finally back to me. His brilliant, calculating mind was completely short-circuiting. He could not comprehend how his flawless, highly insulated criminal enterprise was currently being dismantled by the federal government in the middle of his own celebration. I stepped away from the crystal podium and walked slowly across the stage, until I was standing merely inches away from my trembling brother. I looked down at him, letting all 12 years of my suppressed anger and righteous vengeance settle perfectly into my steady gaze. The warm smile faded from my face, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that made him physically shrink away from me. Did you really think I just sat in a concrete cell for 12 years doing absolutely nothing? Edward, I asked, my voice low, but carrying an undeniable, devastating weight. Did you think I spent 4,000 days staring at a wall while you stole my life and poisoned my tea? You severely underestimated my patience. For the last 4 years, I was not just a disgraced convict. I was a highly classified confidential informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Edward let out a choked, breathless gasp. His eyes widened to the point of tearing. He shook his head weakly, unable to form a single coherent word. We knew all about your massive cartel laundering ring. I continued relentlessly, making sure he understood the absolute totality of his defeat. We tracked every single offshore account, every dummy corporation, and every illicit wire transfer you made using my forged signature. But the federal prosecutors had a major problem. Because you were so incredibly meticulous about hiding behind my name, they could not legally prove you were the sole architect of the criminal enterprise without a shadow of a doubt. They needed you to step out from behind my shadow. They needed you to willingly and publicly claim total, undeniable ownership of the contaminated assets. We just needed you to formally claim sole ownership of the illicit assets to bypass those complex corporate shielding laws. That thick stack of papers you are desperately clutching is not your ticket to freedom, I whispered, stepping back. It is your signed, verified confession. The tall undercover agent climbed the short flight of stairs and walked purposefully onto the stage. He was Agent Mitchell, the lead financial investigator who had worked with me in the shadows for 4 grueling years. He holstered his weapon and stepped directly in front of my brother. Edward was trembling so violently that his knees seemed ready to buckle. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic shell of a man. Agent Mitchell reached out and firmly took the signed relinquishment contract right out from Edward's weak, trembling hands. He flipped through the crisp pages, his eyes scanning the perfectly executed signatures I had provided just minutes earlier. He snapped the folio shut with a sharp, definitive sound that echoed across the quiet stage. He looked at Edward with an expression of pure professional disdain. Thank you for documenting your sole liability for the cartel debt. Edward, Agent Mitchell said coldly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. You have just made our absolute hardest job incredibly easy to finish tonight. It is truly over for you. The entire criminal syndicate you spent 12 years building is going to be completely dismantled piece by careful piece. And you will be spending the rest of your miserable life inside a concrete federal prison cell. The reality of those words crashed into Edward with devastating force. He stood completely frozen on the brightly lit stage, staring at the cold handcuffs dangling from the agent's hands. He started hyperventilating, drawing in short breaths as the walls of his criminal empire rapidly collapsed around him. The sophisticated corporate titan was completely gone. In his place stood a desperate animal thrashing against an inescapable trap. He shook his head so violently that sweat flew from his forehead and splattered against the crystal podium. He looked frantically past Agent Mitchell and locked his terrified eyes onto the undercover cartel representatives standing at the bottom of the stage stairs. Wait! Edward screamed, his voice pitching upward into a shrill wail of sheer panic. You do not understand. We can still fix this. The company still holds all the original patents. We still possess the foundational source code that drives the entire global infrastructure. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands raised in a pathetic, begging gesture toward the men he thought were his partners. I will sell the patents tomorrow morning. Edward pleaded, his words tripping over each other in desperate haste. I can liquidate the intellectual property. I can make you completely whole. I still own the tech. I still control the most valuable software algorithm in this industry. We can pay off the entire debt. You just have to give me 24 hours to secure the buyers. I stood perfectly still, watching my brother humiliating himself in front of the federal agents and fleeing corporate elites. I allowed him to exhaust his final reserve of false hope. When his frantic begging faded into breathless panting, I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I moved past Agent Mitchell, inserting myself directly between the federal authorities and the man who shared my blood. Edward looked at me, his eyes wide and completely feral, silently pleading for a lifeline he did not deserve. I reached inside the breast pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket. My fingers bypassed the silver fountain pen and wrapped around a secondary legal document I had carried all night. I slowly pulled out a crisp piece of ivory parchment, unfolding it with agonizing slowness under the harsh glare of the spotlight. "No, Edward," I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that demanded absolute silence from everyone in the ballroom. "No, you absolutely do not." Edward stared at the folded paper, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the document in my hands. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. "What is that?" he croaked, the false bravado completely drained from his trembling voice. "This is the ultimate consequence of underestimating your older brother," I replied smoothly. 13 years ago, long before the federal investigators ever raided our corporate offices, long before you forged my digital signature and framed me for your early crimes, I noticed a few troubling discrepancies in our accounting ledgers. I did not know exactly what you were planning back then, but my instincts told me to protect the foundational architecture of my life's work. I refused to leave my greatest creation vulnerable to anyone, not even my own family. So I took an immediate classified precaution. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us, until I could see the tiny reflections of my own face in his panicking eyes. I quietly transferred the exclusive copyright of our core algorithm and every single foundational software patent out of Caldwell Tech. I reassigned total ownership to a completely anonymous holding company registered under the name Aegis Systems. I am the sole owner of that holding company, and I always have been. Edward's jaw dropped slack. He shook his head back and forth in rapid movements, unable to process the magnitude of the corporate checkmate I had just revealed. "That is entirely impossible," he stammered, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "Caldwell Tech has been running that software every single day for the past 12 years. We built the entire cartel laundering network on top of that specific algorithmic infrastructure. If we did not own it, how were we using it?" "Because you were renting it," I explained, delivering the words with cold, surgical precision. Caldwell Tech never actually owned the proprietary software that made the company valuable. The company has merely been licensing that software on a highly restrictive lease from Aegis Systems, a lease that strictly prohibited any involvement in illicit financial activities. And because you violated those operational terms by washing millions of dollars in dirty cartel money, I exercised my legal right as the sole owner of Aegis Systems. I officially terminated the licensing lease yesterday morning. The profound silence that blanketed the ballroom was heavy enough to crush a man's soul. Edward swayed on his feet, the color draining from his face until his skin resembled pale ash. The horrifying reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick layer of desperate denial. He was beginning to understand the full devastating architecture of the trap I had spent 4 years building with the federal authorities. I stepped right into Edward's face, towering over his trembling frame, ensuring he felt the absolute weight of his impending doom. "You did not steal a $50 million tech company 12 years ago," Edward Thirst stated, my voice echoing with ruthless finality. "You stole a completely empty corporate shell. You spent a decade inflating that shell with over $100 million in toxic, illicit cartel debt. You thought you were the mastermind. You thought you were using my legacy to build an untouchable criminal empire. But all you were doing was packing explosives around your own feet." I pointed down at the signed relinquishment contract that Agent Mitchell was currently holding. "And the greatest tragedy of your greedy life is that you were so desperate to secure your stolen wealth tonight. You were so terrified that I might try to claim a piece of the pie that you forced me to sign away my rights. You demanded that I separate myself from Caldwell Tech, in front of witnesses, leaving you as the sole owner of the corporate entity. You just voluntarily signed a legally binding document, making yourself personally responsible for every single penny of that $100 million cartel debt. Edward let out a strangled sound, caught between a sob and a scream. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto the stage, landing hard on his knees. He raised his shaking hands to his face, pulling violently at his own hair as his mind fractured under the crushing realization. He was going to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, and he owed $100 million to the most dangerous men on the planet. He had no leverage. He had no assets. He had no escape. The magnificent empire he thought he had stolen from me was nothing more than a brilliantly constructed, toxic mirage. I stood over his weeping, broken body, feeling a profound sense of absolute vindication washing over my soul as I watched his entire life finally crumble to dust. The crushing weight of his absolute destruction finally settled over Edward like a suffocating shroud. He remained on his knees, his tailored tuxedo clinging to his sweat-soaked frame. It was a terrifying, inescapable certainty. He was not just losing the $50 million company he had stolen from me. He was going to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of his natural life. He had just signed a legally binding document, making himself personally responsible for $100 million in illicit debt to an international cartel. They were ruthless killers who would hunt him to the ends of the earth. He had placed a massive permanent target squarely on his own back. I watched his chest heave as he struggled to draw oxygen into his panicking lungs. His calculating mind was completely short-circuiting. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I stood above him perfectly calm, my posture straight and unyielding. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I simply watched him drown in the exact same ocean of despair he had so ruthlessly thrown me into. The suffocating panic in Edward suddenly mutated into something else entirely. The fear in his eyes hardened into a blind, feral rage. He realized that every single agonizing consequence he was about to face was directly because of my silent, patient orchestration. With a guttural, animalistic roar that tore from the depths of his throat, Edward lunged upward. He threw his entire body weight toward me, desperate to wrap his fingers around my neck. He did not care about the flashing cameras or the armed tactical units. He only wanted to destroy the man who had outsmarted him, but he never even came close to touching me. Before I could shift my stance to defend myself, two heavily armored federal agents intercepted his path with brutal efficiency. One agent slammed his shoulder directly into Edward's chest, lifting him off his feet and driving him backward. The second agent grabbed his flailing arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Edward crashed hard against the polished wooden floor of the stage, the impact forcing a loud gasp of air from his lungs. The agents did not hesitate. They drove their heavy knees into his back, pinning him firmly to the ground. Edward thrashed wildly, screaming incoherent curses and violent threats, his face contorted in a mask of pure madness. Steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, snapping shut with a metallic click. He was completely immobilized, his face pressed humiliatingly against the floor, panting and spitting as the reality of his confinement locked into place. As the agents hauled my screaming brother toward the exit, a sudden movement caught my attention. Diana had been cowering near the edge of the stage, her expensive silk gown tangled around her shaking legs. The elegant, sophisticated socialite who had coldly poured poison into my tea just 24 hours ago was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, sniveling coward. Seeing her partner in crime being dragged away in chains, she realized that her own protective shield had entirely evaporated. The federal authorities were not going to let her walk out of this room. She was an active co-conspirator, a perjurer, and an attempted murderer. Her glamorous stolen life was over. Diana scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain as her bare skin scraped against the hard wooden stage. She crawled frantically across the floor until she reached my feet. She threw her arms out, grabbing fiercely onto the fabric of my black tuxedo pants. Her makeup was completely ruined, running down her pale cheeks in dark, messy streaks. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a pathetic, manufactured desperation. She squeezed my leg tightly, digging her manicured nails into the fabric, as if I were a floating piece of debris in a raging, turbulent sea. "Richard, please," Diana wailed, her voice shrill and grating over the remaining ambient noise in the room. "You have to listen to me." He made me do it. Edward forced me to lie in court. He threatened to destroy me if I did not memorize that script and testify against you. He manipulated my mind when I was vulnerable and scared. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to survive his abuse. Please, Richard. You know the kind of woman I really am. I never stopped caring about you. I still love you." The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was attempting to use the very same manipulative tactics she had employed to steal my life 12 years ago. She actually believed she could shed a few tears, play the helpless, coerced victim, and convince me to protect her from the federal prosecutors. She thought my heart was still soft enough to forgive her ultimate betrayal. I did not move away from her. I simply stood perfectly still and looked down at her tear-stained face with absolute unyielding disgust. I felt no sorrow for the woman crying at my feet. I felt no lingering attachment to the memories we once shared. She was nothing more than a poisonous parasite who had fed on my success and conspired to rot my brain. I reached my right hand deep into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket. My fingers bypassed the silver fountain pen and closed around a small cylindrical glass object. I slowly pulled my hand out, revealing a tiny glass vial sealed with a black rubber stopper. Inside the transparent glass rested a fine, pale yellow powder. It was the exact neurotoxic chemical she had been meticulously crushing and dissolving into my nightly chamomile tea. I had managed to secure the remainder of her stash earlier that afternoon while she was busy getting her hair styled for the grand gala. I held the small glass vial up to the bright overhead spotlight, ensuring she could see exactly what it was. The moment Diana recognized the container, her desperate sobbing abruptly stopped. Her eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing terror. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came out. She realized I knew absolutely everything. I knew about the forged documents, the offshore accounts, and the slow, deliberate attempt to murder my cognitive functions. I opened my fingers and let the glass vial fall. It dropped through the air and landed perfectly in the center of her lap, resting against the expensive silk fabric of her designer evening gown. "Tell it to the judge, Diana," I said, my voice cold, flat, and devoid of any human sympathy. "Enjoy the food in federal prison." I stepped back firmly, pulling my pant leg completely out of her desperate, grasping grip. Two female federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Diana forcefully by her bare arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. She began to shriek, a high-pitched, agonizing sound of pure terror and total defeat. She kicked and thrashed, screaming my name over and over again, as the agents dragged her away from the stage and out of the grand ballroom, leaving me standing alone in the quiet, absolute triumph of my reclaimed life. The grand ballroom, once a glittering symbol of my brother's stolen triumph, was now an active, chaotic federal crime scene. The flashing cameras of the press were quickly corralled by tactical units, though enough sensational footage had already been captured to dominate the global news cycle for months to come. I stood near the clear crystal podium watching the dramatic aftermath unfold with a profound sense of absolute tranquility. Agent Mitchell approached me, his heavy tactical boots crunching loudly over the broken glass and scattered champagne flutes that littered the floor. He removed his protective helmet and extended a firm, highly respectful hand toward me. I took it, feeling the solid grip of a man who knew exactly what we had sacrificed to reach this impossible moment. He looked me directly in the eyes and delivered the words I had waited 4,000 agonizing days to hear. "The paperwork has been fully processed by the Department of Justice Agent Mitchell," said his voice carrying a quiet but undeniable weight over the surrounding noise. "Your exoneration is officially complete, Richard. The federal judge signed the executive order this morning. Every single fraudulent charge has been completely expunged from your record. You are no longer a convicted felon. You are a free man with a completely clean slate. I closed my eyes, letting the immense gravity of his words wash over my tired soul. The invisible, suffocating chains that had bound my wrists for 12 years shattered into fine dust. I took a deep, steadying breath and opened my eyes to see Harrison walking purposefully onto the brightly lit stage. My fiercely loyal attorney did not look like a struggling, defeated paralegal anymore. He stood incredibly tall, radiating the sharp, brilliant legal mind that Edward had so desperately tried to destroy all those years ago. Harrison reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a familiar, gleaming object. It was my father's vintage gold timepiece. He had personally retrieved it from Edward's wrist during the aggressive arrest procedure. Harrison held the gold watch out to me, a silent, powerful testament to our shared victory. I took the watch, feeling the cool, heavy metal resting solidly in my palm. It was not just a piece of expensive jewelry. It was the physical embodiment of my family's true legacy, finally untainted by my brother's treacherous, consuming greed. I slowly strapped the worn leather band around my wrist, buckling it securely into place. The familiar, comforting weight of it against my skin felt exactly like the miraculous return of my own soul. I turned my attention back to the remaining guests in the massive ballroom. The shell-shocked board members of Caldwell Tech were huddled together near the overturned VYP tables, looking at me with a potent mixture of profound guilt and absolute paralyzing terror. They knew they had completely abandoned me, and they knew I now held their professional fates entirely in my two hands. I stepped up to the microphone one last time. My voice echoed clearly across the silent, heavily guarded room, demanding total attention. Caldwell Tech is officially dead, I announced, delivering the final corporate verdict without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. The company you all knew and profited from was nothing more than a corrupted, hollow shell, and it will be completely liquidated by the federal government tomorrow morning to settle the illicit debts my brother accumulated. But the foundational technology, the proprietary algorithms, and the true untainted vision behind this empire belong exclusively to Aegis Systems. I paused intentionally, letting my sharp gaze sweep over the terrified corporate executives who had once betrayed me. Aegis Systems is launching tomorrow morning, I continued smoothly. We will be operating with a completely clean slate and a renewed culture of absolute unwavering integrity. We are actively hiring, but we will be highly selective about who we bring into our new home. And I am incredibly proud to announce that Harrison Wright will be stepping in immediately as my Chief Operating Officer. Harrison stood proudly beside me, nodding firmly to the captivated crowd, officially reclaiming his rightful place at the absolute pinnacle of the corporate world. I stepped down from the grand stage, leaving the shattered, smoking ruins of my brother's criminal empire behind me. I walked across the polished marble floor toward the heavy brass exit doors. I did not lean on a wooden cane. I did not shuffle my feet or slump my tired shoulders. I walked with the powerful, unyielding stride of a man who had just conquered his own darkest demons. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped out into the crisp, cool New York night air. The city lights blazed brilliantly against the dark, endless sky, welcoming me back to the world of the living. Fast forward exactly 6 months. I stood quietly by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly renovated Manhattan penthouse office, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent city skyline. The federal trials had concluded swiftly and without mercy. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence we had gathered, combined with my own detailed testimony, both Edward and Diana were found guilty on multiple severe counts of corporate fraud, international money laundering, and gross perjury. I attended their final sentencing hearing, just to watch the judge strike the gavel. Edward looked completely broken, his arrogant posture replaced by a permanent trembling slouch as he realized he would never wear a tailored suit again. Diana wept hysterically in the courtroom, begging the judge for a mercy that she had never once shown me. They were both sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, entirely without the possibility of early parole. They would spend their final days in concrete cages, experiencing the exact nightmare they had so willingly designed for me. The international cartel assets were systematically seized and dismantled by coordinated federal task forces. Meanwhile, Aegis Systems had officially launched its revolutionary new logistics software to massive global acclaim. The clean, unburdened company was thriving well beyond my wildest expectations, effectively tripling my original net worth in a matter of a few short months. The market recognized our integrity, and our success was entirely unstoppable. Harrison walked into my spacious office holding 2 heavy crystal glasses and a sealed bottle of 18-year-old bourbon. He poured the rich amber liquid, handing a glass directly to me. We stood together in the quiet, sophisticated elegance of the penthouse, raising our glasses in a silent, deeply meaningful toast. We toasted to our unwavering patience, to our meticulous strategy, and to the absolute, undeniable certainty of karma. I took a slow sip of the smooth bourbon, feeling the comforting warmth spread deeply through my chest. The 12 agonizing years I lost inside that concrete cell could never be returned to me. But they were not wasted. They had forged me into a razor-sharp weapon entirely capable of excising the toxic, greedy cancer from my life. Finally, after a decade of living in the darkest shadows, I was truly, completely free. Fast forward exactly 6 months. I stood quietly by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly renovated Manhattan penthouse office. The morning sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the sprawling city skyline, illuminating the bustling streets below. It was a breathtaking view, one that I had dreamed about during my darkest days in that cramped concrete federal cell. The air in the office smelled of rich mahogany and fresh espresso, a stark contrast to the sterile, oppressive scent of the prison I had endured for 12 long years. I still remember the harsh metallic clang of the iron doors shutting behind me, sealing me away from the world I had built. Now those doors were open forever. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the profound sense of absolute freedom fill my lungs. The transition from a disgraced, forgotten convict to the undisputed owner of a thriving technology empire had been nothing short of miraculous. But it was not a miracle born of luck. It was the direct result of unwavering patience, meticulous strategy, and the relentless pursuit of ultimate justice. I turned away from the breathtaking window and walked slowly over to my expansive, custom-built desk. The smooth, polished surface was completely clear, save for a few neatly organized legal files resting perfectly in the center. Those thick files contained the final definitive chapters of the nightmare my family had forced upon me. I placed my hand flat against the cool leather portfolio, feeling a profound sense of closure radiating through my fingertips. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a clear, unburdened horizon. The federal trials had concluded swiftly and without a single ounce of mercy. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence we had gathered, combined with my own detailed first-hand testimony, the prosecution case was entirely bulletproof. Edward and Diana tried desperately to turn against each other in the crowded courtroom. They pointed trembling fingers and traded vicious, ugly accusations in a pathetic attempt to save their own skins. But the federal judge saw right through their cowardly, desperate manipulations. They were both found guilty on multiple severe counts of corporate fraud, international money laundering, and gross perjury. I attended their final sentencing hearing, just to watch the judge strike the heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. Edward looked completely broken. His arrogant, polished posture was permanently replaced by a trembling, defeated slouch, as he realized he would never wear a tailored suit or command a corporate boardroom ever again. Diana wept hysterically, burying her face in her shackled hands, begging the court for a leniency that she had never once shown me when she coldly orchestrated my ruin. They were both officially sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, entirely without the possibility of early parole. They would spend their final days locked in concrete cages, experiencing the exact same suffocating isolation they had so willingly designed for me. The massive international cartel assets they had managed were systematically seized and completely dismantled by coordinated federal task forces. Their illicit empire was erased from existence, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own monumental regrets. The millions they had once stolen were gone. They learned the hardest way possible that building a life on a foundation of lies only guarantees a spectacular, unavoidable collapse when the foundation finally crumbles into dust. Meanwhile, Aegis Systems had officially launched its revolutionary new logistics software to massive, unprecedented global acclaim. The clean, unburdened company was thriving well beyond my wildest expectations. Without the toxic weight of my brother's criminal enterprises holding us back, our proprietary algorithms revolutionized the industry supply chain across the entire world. In a matter of a few short months, the incredibly successful launch effectively tripled my original net worth. The market recognized our absolute integrity, and our corporate momentum was entirely unstoppable. The heavy oak doors of my office opened with a soft, quiet click. Harrison walked in looking sharp and incredibly confident in his new role as my chief operating officer. He carried 2 heavy crystal glasses and a sealed bottle of rare 18-year-old bourbon. He walked over to the small wet bar near my desk, uncorked the dark glass bottle, and poured the rich amber liquid. He handed a glass directly to me, a proud, knowing smile resting comfortably on his face. We stood together in the quiet, sophisticated elegance of the penthouse, raising our glasses in a silent, deeply meaningful toast. We toasted to our unwavering patience, to our meticulous strategy, and to the absolute, undeniable certainty of karma. I took a slow sip of the smooth bourbon, feeling the comforting warmth spread deeply through my chest. I turned to look out over the city skyline once more. The 12 agonizing years I lost inside that concrete cell could never be returned to me. But as I stood there in the sunlight, I realized they were not wasted. They had forged me into a razor-sharp weapon entirely capable of excising the toxic, greedy cancer from my life. Finally, after a decade of living in the darkest shadows, I was truly, completely free. Trust is the most valuable currency a man can possess, but blind trust is the quickest path to absolute ruin. When you spend your entire life building a meaningful legacy, you must always be prepared to defend it from those standing closest to you. The most devastating betrayal rarely comes from your known enemies. It almost always comes from those who smile warmly at your dinner table, the ones who claim to love you while secretly plotting your downfall. Time is the ultimate judge and the ultimate truth-teller. It may take a single day, or it may take 12 agonizing years, but the truth will inevitably rise to the surface and shatter the darkest of lies. Never let immense hardship or profound injustice break your spirit. Instead, let the heavy weight of those trials forge you into someone completely unbreakable. True justice is rarely swift, and it is almost never easy, but it requires ultimate, unwavering patience. If you can maintain your focus, keep your mind sharp, and refuse to surrender to despair, you will eventually find the perfect moment to strike back. You must become the silent storm that your enemies never see coming until it is far too late for them to run. If my story of surviving profound betrayal and fighting back for ultimate justice resonated with you today, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments exactly where you are watching from today, and tell me if you have ever had to bravely stand up against the people who severely underestimated your true worth. I read every single comment, and your incredible support means the absolute world to me. Please share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that they are strong enough to overcome their darkest days. Stay sharp, always trust your deepest gut instincts, and never ever stop fighting for the beautiful life you rightfully deserve. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, yeah. the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love.